Dim the lights. Listen. The wind claws at the wooden walls, howling like some forgotten god, but inside this Viking longhouse, there is warmth. You feel it as soon as you step in, the smoky heat of a fire pit, its orange glow painting shifting shadows across rough-hewn beams. The air is thick with the smell of pine tar, smoked fish, and wet wool drying near the hearth. Children doze in furs by the wall. A dog lifts its head, watching you with ember-bright eyes before settling back down. At the center of the hall, a skald, an old storyteller with a voice like gravel and honey, begins to speak. His words weave through the room, carrying tales of gods and giants, of Thor's hammer striking down trolls, of Odin wandering the 9 worlds in search of wisdom. You can hear the long, low hum of agreement from the men and women around the fire. Warriors, farmers, mothers with calloused hands, faces lit by flame, dreaming of battles fought and feasts yet to come. One day, the skald intones, you will feast with the Allfather in the great hall of Valhalla, if your courage earns it. A child gasps. A warrior smirks. Somewhere in the rafters, the wind howls again, like it knows these people do not fear it. Imagine standing there with them, feeling the fire on your skin, the mead burning your throat, the weight of a life lived between the plow and the sword. This is not the world of simple raiders and horn helmet caricatures. This is a world of hearths and rituals, of voyages and dreams of Valhalla. And tonight we are stepping inside. The image you've been sold of the Vikings is simple, isn't it? Wild-eyed marauders in longships, axes raised, howling as they descend upon some poor, unsuspecting monastery. Smoke. Screams. Blood on the stones. It's the version of history that makes for excellent TV, but it's also a half-truth. Step back with me for a moment. Let's leave the battlefield. Step off the deck of the dragon-headed ship. Come with me inland, to a quiet Nordic village on a mist-soaked morning. The air is cold enough to bite, filled with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke curling up from turf-roofed homes. A rooster crows lazily, a rooster that has no idea it belongs to people the world will one day call the terror of Christendom. And there, near the edge of the village, a man with a face weathered by salt and wind is feeding his goats. That's right. Goats. This is what we rarely talk about. The Vikings spent far more time as farmers, traders, and craftsmen than they ever did as warriors. For every man who set out to raid the English coast, there were dozens more who stayed home, mending nets, building boats, tending to barley fields, and trying desperately to survive the long winters. And make no mistake, survival here was its own kind of battle. You know what they didn't tell you in school? The real enemy of the Norse wasn't always the King of England. It was January. Imagine waking up in a sod-walled house during the dead of winter. The fire in the hearth has burned down to embers, leaving the air cold enough to make your breath visible. Your bed, if you can call a pile of straw covered in animal skins a bed, smells faintly of smoke and slightly more strongly of sheep. You can't feel your toes. And your first thought isn't, "Who shall I raid today?" It's, "Do we have enough dried fish to last the week?" That's the reality of Viking life. It was a world balanced precariously between feast and famine, between long ships and long winters. Viking men weren't full-time warriors. They were, first and foremost, subsistence farmers. And their farms? Let's just say they weren't exactly the lush gardens of France. Most lived on rugged, rocky soil carved out of forests or scraped from the edges of fjords. They grew hardy grains like barley, rye, and oats. They raised sheep for wool, goats for milk, and pigs because, well, pork is delicious. Their cattle were small and scrappy, more like walking leather satchels than the cows you're picturing. And women? They ran the show while the men were away. Picture a Viking wife, not some silent figure in the corner, but the head of the household, managing farmhands, overseeing the harvest, and holding the keys, literally. Keys were a symbol of female authority, worn at the waist, jangling with each step like a subtle reminder, this is my domain. When men went raiding, it wasn't because they were bloodthirsty for fun. It was because raiding supplemented what the harsh land couldn't provide. Silver, grain, timber, sometimes even new land to settle. But when the ships returned, they weren't greeted with chants for more conquest. They were met by tired families in need of help threshing barley or fixing the roof before the next storm. Picture the rhythm of a typical day in a Viking settlement. You wake before dawn. The air is heavy with the smell of wood smoke and yesterday's stew. Breakfast? A hunk of bread so dense it could double as a weapon, washed down with watered ale, because the water isn't exactly safe. You go out to tend the fields, or the sheep, or your forge. You trade goods with neighbors. You mend nets for fishing, or carve wood for the next longship. The children? They're working, too, scattering grain for the chickens, gathering firewood, learning the skills they'll need to survive. It's hard. It's repetitive. But it's the glue that holds this world together. And yet, there's levity. Evenings bring song, story, and ale shared around the hearth. The skalds, those beloved storytellers, spin tales of Odin and Thor, of monsters slain and heroes reborn, filling small smoky rooms with the thunder of old words. Maybe there's music, a bone flute, a lyre, the slow thrum of a drum that feels like a heartbeat. This is the side of the Vikings the chronicles of terrified monks never told you about. Here's the thing, the line between raider and villager was blurry. The same man who slaughtered his way through a Saxon village might spend the next season fishing, or rebuilding a barn. It's easy to imagine the Vikings as insatiable marauders. But to them, raiding wasn't about chaos. It was about opportunity. And when that opportunity faded, they stopped. They became settlers, traders, even Christians. That's why you find Viking burials in England filled not just with swords, but with plows, hammers, and even prayer beads. So next time you picture a Viking, don't just imagine the blood-spattered warrior on a foreign shore. Picture the father teaching his son to shape a plank for a boat. The mother counting the stores of smoked fish. The elderly grandmother by the fire, telling a story of Odin's wisdom, as she's done 100 times before. Violence may have made them famous. But it was the quieter, steadier life, the farming, the crafting, the dreaming, that made them endure. Come on! The fire's dying down. Let's step outside the longhouse for a moment. Feel that sting of the northern wind on your cheeks? That's the sea calling. And next, we'll talk about the homes they built, the families they raised, and the world they made in these harsh lands. Step outside with me. The night air is sharp. It slices into your lungs like cold steel. Above us, the sky stretches forever, stars scattered like spilled silver across a black velvet cloth. You can almost see why these people believed the cosmos itself was a great tree, its branches reaching endlessly, its roots coiling into unseen worlds. And there, crouched against the wind, is a Viking longhouse. At first glance, it's humble. Low to the ground, its turf-covered roof blending into the landscape, as if it's half buried in the earth. You'd walk right past it if you didn't know better. But step inside? Ah, that's when you understand. Duck through the narrow doorway, and suddenly you're wrapped in warmth and smoke. The air smells of wood smoke and pine tar, but also of sweat, wool, and whatever's been bubbling in the iron pot hanging over the central hearth for the last 3 days. It's earthy. Let's call it that. The longhouse isn't one room. It's one world. Picture this, a single hall stretching 30, 40, sometimes even 70 feet long, with thick timber walls and a roof supported by massive beams, whole trees, really, turned upside down to hold up someone's life. Benches line the sides, covered in animal furs that double as seating by day and beds by night. In the center? The hearth, always burning, its smoke drifting upward through a hole in the roof, though much of it decides to linger around your head instead. This is the beating heart of Viking life. A house full of everything. And I do mean everything. Family, servants, farmhands, even animals on the coldest nights. All under one roof. Privacy? Forget it. If you wanted alone time, you went to the outhouse. And even then, well, good luck. Children scamper between adults as they work, sometimes with small wooden toys, sometimes with sharp tools because apparently, child safety wasn't invented until at least the 20th century. A dog curls up by the fire, twitching in some dream of chasing deer. Somewhere near the doorway, a sheep bleats, indignant that it's now part of the household. Can you smell it? That potent blend of wet wool, hay, smoke, and whatever passes for personal hygiene when your last bath was, last midsummer? It's not exactly lavender-scented candle material, but in a way, it's comforting. It smells like survival. By day, the longhouse is a workshop. Looms clatter as women weave wool into thick, scratchy cloth. Someone's hammering iron in a corner. The Vikings were great blacksmiths, and the line between farm tool and war weapon was thinner than a sword edge. Meals are cooked over the fire, thin stews, hearty porridge, flatbreads baked on stones. By night, it transforms into a living tapestry. Meals are eaten together, stories are shared. If there's ale, and if it hasn't gone sour, cups are passed around, and the hum of conversation blends with the occasional burst of laughter. And then, there's the storytelling. Forget TV. Forget TikTok. In the Viking Age, entertainment was a skald, a poet, a singer, a memory keeper, whose words brought gods and heroes into this very room. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the flicker of the fire on the faces around you, the creak of timber in the wind, the deep, steady voice of the skald as he recounts the sagas. Odin wandering the 9 worlds in search of wisdom. Thor, red-bearded and indignant, smashing trolls to bits with Mjolnir. The trickster Loki causing chaos just for the joy of it. These stories weren't just for fun. They were history. Moral lessons. And sometimes, let's be honest, a way to make a dark winter night a little less unbearable. Romantic, isn't it? But don't be fooled, life in the longhouse wasn't cozy hygge 24/7. It was labor. Endless, backbreaking labor. Winters meant mending tools, spinning wool, carving wood, repairing boats, anything to keep hands busy and minds from wandering into despair. Summers? You were in the fields or on the water from dawn to dusk. Even their buildings were in a constant state of negotiation with the elements. Roofs leaked. Walls shifted. Smoke blackened everything. But the longhouse endured, just as its people did, not because it was perfect, but because it was enough. So, now you've seen the Viking home. Lived it for a moment. Felt the warmth of the fire, and the chill of the draft sneaking under the door. But if you stay long enough, you'll notice another rhythm rising in this world. Not just the work. Not just the survival. Something celebratory. Because if there's one thing the Vikings knew how to do, even in the harshest of times, it was feast. And that's where we're going next. Pull up a bench. Grab a drinking horn. Because the mead hall is calling. You smell it before you see it. Meat roasting over an open fire, fat sizzling and spitting onto the coals with little hisses. The earthy tang of fermented fish. The sweetness of honeyed mead being poured into drinking horns. And beneath it all, that unmistakable background perfume of humanity, sweat, wool, and smoke. Welcome to a Viking feast, where hunger meets ritual and chaos meets celebration. The longhouse is transformed. Where earlier it was a workshop and a shelter, now it feels like a mead hall, a place alive with noise and heat and the barely restrained energy of people who've spent too many cold nights waiting for an excuse to indulge. This is more than dinner. This is theater. First, let's set expectations. Forget neatly laid tables or a Pinterest-worthy spread. Vikings didn't do placemats. Meals happened on long wooden boards, often laid across trestles or even knees, and the plates? Trenchers, slabs of bread so stale they doubled as plates for meat and broth. Fun fact, sometimes these trencher breads were eaten after the meal, sometimes fed to dogs, and sometimes given to the poor. Which is kind of generous, unless you think about how much dog saliva was probably on them by then. Cutlery? Your fingers. Knives were personal, you brought your own, and spoons were a luxury, so good luck with soup. Want to look dignified while drinking? Try balancing a drinking horn the size of your forearm without spilling half of it on your lap. It's clumsy, a little greasy, and frankly, perfect. Daily Viking meals were simple. Barley porridge. Fish. Maybe a bit of cheese if you hadn't bartered it away for a new axe head. But on feast days? Oh, that's when the Norse turned survival food into something resembling decadence. Whole animals were spit-roasted, sheep, pigs, sometimes even a horse if the occasion was sacred enough. There'd be fish by the barrel, pickled or smoked, because nothing says party like a side of herring. And the bread, dense rye loaves, hearty enough to survive a month at sea or double as a blunt weapon. They loved dairy too. Butter, curds, skyr, think Icelandic yogurt that could probably survive a nuclear winter. And if you were lucky, you might even get to taste the rare imported luxuries, spices from the east, or walnuts traded from some far-off land that no one in the hall could even pronounce. And then there was the drink. The star of any Viking feast was mead, honey wine, golden and deceptively strong. It was a drink with mythology attached, literally. The Norse believed mead was the gift of the gods, brewed from the blood of the wise being Kvaser. Which is a polite way of saying, every horn you drink brings you closer to divine wisdom, or at least to falling face first into the fire pit with a smile on your face. Mead was so central that even toasts became a kind of performance. These weren't casual clinks of the glass. Every toast was a ritual, to the gods, to ancestors, to fallen warriors, to the host, to the king, and sometimes just to whoever happened to stand up and demand one. You couldn't refuse a toast either. Refusal was an insult. Which means, yes, sometimes you ended up drinking yourself halfway to Helheim because Uncle Olaf wouldn't stop making speeches. Speaking of drunkenness, the sagas are full of stories about Vikings drinking themselves into legendary trouble. One of my favorites? The tale of a feast where two warriors got into a boasting contest over who had the better sword. It ended with one of them chopping a chunk out of the longhouse wall to prove his blade's worth. He won the argument, but the host was apparently less than thrilled about the new draft in his living room. And then there's the story of Harald Fairhair, Norway's first king, who once threw a feast so rowdy that his men accidentally set the longhouse on fire. They saved the mead first. Priorities. This wasn't just gluttony. Feasting was sacred. Big gatherings often coincided with blots, sacrificial festivals for the gods. Animals were slaughtered, their blood offered to Odin, Freyr, or Thor. And yes, sometimes splashed on the walls of the longhouse for good measure. You know. Festive decor. Afterward, the meat was cooked and shared. Eating together wasn't just about filling bellies. It was about binding the community, forging loyalty between lords and warriors, and reminding everyone that even in the harshest of lands, the gods were watching, and the hall was a place of plenty. Close your eyes. Hear it. The clash of drinking horns. The thump of bare feet on packed earth. The rough, rhythmic chanting of men who've had far too much mead and not nearly enough water. A skald reciting poetry over the din, his words half drowned by laughter and arguments about whose uncle actually killed that bear last spring. And underneath it all? That drumbeat feeling in your chest, part music, part the unspoken knowledge that for tonight, at least, you are alive, you are fed, and you are among your people. And when the feast ends? Well, let's just say Vikings didn't invent the hangover, but they certainly perfected it. Imagine waking up in a smoky longhouse, head pounding, trying to remember why your tunic smells like goat. No aspirin. No Gatorade. Just cold water from the well and the shame of knowing you challenged a man twice your size to a wrestling match in front of the entire village. But give it a few hours. Someone will stoke the fire. Someone will scrape together the leftovers. And life will resume its steady rhythm, until the next excuse to gather, drink, and sing arrives. But before we leave this feast, wipe the grease from your fingers. Because our journey isn't just about what Vikings ate or drank. It's about what they believed. And their beliefs? Oh, they were as vast and complex as the 9 worlds themselves. So come, let's step out into the night air, under those glimmering stars, and talk about the gods, the rituals, and the dreams of Valhalla that shaped every moment of their lives. Step out with me into the night. The feast has ended. The fire in the longhouse still glows, a fading ember in the dark, but out here under the wide Nordic sky, the stars are sharp and endless, like diamonds scattered by a careless hand. And somewhere out there, beyond the reach of mortal sight, the 9 worlds turn. This is where the Vikings truly lived, not just in their farms and mead halls, but in the stories that tied their world together. You know what's fascinating? Norse mythology wasn't just a set of bedtime stories or temple recitations. It was the air these people breathed. When a farmer tilled his frozen field, he might mutter a quiet prayer to Freyr for a good harvest. When a sailor pushed his longship into a restless sea, he asked NJR for safe passage. And if your goat died mysteriously? Well, that was Loki's fault. Obviously. These gods weren't distant. They were in the kitchen, the field, the bedchamber. Every action had a cosmic shadow, and every shadow, a story. The Norse pantheon wasn't a neat, harmonious family. It was a soap opera with swords. At the top stood Odin, the All-Father, god of wisdom, war, and poetry. Picture a one-eyed wanderer in a wide-brimmed hat, trading comfort for knowledge. Sounds noble, right? Except Odin also lied, cheated, and manipulated his way into power. Fun fact: he once hung himself from a tree for 9 days to gain wisdom from the runes. And then, this is my favorite, he gave up his actual eye to drink from the well of Mimir. All for wisdom. Odin is the friend who'll trade a kidney for a good crossword puzzle. Then there's Thor, his son, red-bearded, hammer-wielding, and, let's just say, not the brightest spark in the forge. Thor was the muscle of the family, protector of Midgard, but his solution to most problems was hit it very hard. It usually worked. Usually. And of course, Loki. Trickster, shapeshifter, chaos incarnate. The kind of dinner guest who steals your silverware, turns into a horse, and comes back the next morning with a foal. Yes, that actually happens in the myths. Look up Sleipnir, Odin's 8-legged horse. You'll never look at Loki the same way. These weren't perfect gods. They were flawed, contradictory, and that made them relatable. Faith in the Norse world wasn't about pews or sermons. It was about offering blood, sweat, and occasionally your best goat. Blots were sacrifices, great communal rituals to honor the gods, elves, or spirits. Animals were slaughtered, their blood sprinkled on altars, halls, and sometimes the people themselves. Imagine someone tossing a ladle of warm pig's blood over your head and calling it a blessing. You'd need a lot of mead to smile through that. But blots weren't grim affairs. They were tied to feasts, music, and togetherness. The gods received their portion, the smoke of the roasting meat rising skyward, and the people ate the rest. It was divine communion and dinner party rolled into one. The Norse year turned on the hinge of festivals. Midwinter brought Yule, a time of fire, feasting, and, according to some sources, a little human sacrifice to ensure the sun's return. Midsummer honored fertility and the harvest, with bonfires and games that might make your modern backyard barbecue look tame. Even the dead had their time, festivals where ancestors were remembered, graves visited, and offerings left to keep their spirits content. Because nothing ruins a good harvest like an angry ghost. Want a glimpse into how these gods weren't just worshipped, but also laughed at? There's a saga where Odin disguises himself as a farmhand to steal a giant's mead of poetry. Classic all-father move. But instead of a clean heist, Odin ends up seducing the giant's daughter, drinking way too much, transforming into an eagle, and then nearly getting caught by a mob of other giants as he flees back to Asgard. The moral? Even the wisest god in the pantheon was one bad night away from chaos. It wasn't just priests who dealt with the divine. Magic, wove through everyday life. Runes carved into weapons for victory. Charms whispered over children to keep them safe from trolls. Women, often called volar, practicing trance-like rituals to glimpse the future. Seer was feared and respected, but also unsettling. It blurred boundaries. Odin himself practiced it, which, awkwardly, was considered unmanly by some. The Allfather didn't care. He wanted power, whatever the cost. You might wonder, why all these stories, rituals, and blood-soaked feasts? Because in a world where winters could kill you, where the sea might swallow you whole, where one bad harvest meant starvation, the gods offered a framework. They made sense of the chaos. They gave meaning to the suffering. And maybe, just maybe, they promised something greater after death. And that's where we go next. You've heard them talk about it in whispers. Valhalla. Hell. A hall of endless feasting or a cold, shadowy underworld. The Norse afterlife wasn't a single place. It was a map of hopes and fears. So come. Let's follow that map. Let's talk about what the Vikings thought awaited them beyond their final battle. You close your eyes. The smoke from the blot still clings to your clothes. Your head feels heavy, from mead, from stories, from the sheer weight of the night. And then, in that strange half-dreaming state, you wonder, what happens when the fire goes out? For the Vikings, death wasn't the end. It was a door. A gate. And on the other side? Well, that depended on who you were, how you died, and, frankly, whether the gods liked you. Imagine this. You open your eyes and find yourself in a great hall so massive the roof is tiled with golden shields. Spears hold up the rafters. Benches stretch beyond sight, crowded with warriors who look like they've been pulled from 100 different lifetimes, scarred, laughing, drinking from horns that never empty. Welcome to Valhalla. Here's the catch. You don't get in for just existing. This is Odin's hall, and he's picky. Valhalla was for those who died in battle, the chosen dead, hand-picked by Valkyries. They're the fierce, wing-cloaked women you may have seen in paintings, but in the sagas, they were more like Odin's HR department. Died bravely? Check. No mortal wounds caused by tripping over your own sword? Check. Into the hall you go. Once inside? Eternal glory. But don't get too cozy. Valhalla wasn't about lounging. Every day, you fight. Literally fight to the death, alongside the other warriors. Then, at night, your wounds vanish, and you feast. Rose spore. Rivers of mead. Endless storytelling. And the next morning? You do it all again. It's intense. Basically an eternal CrossFit session with a buffet and no hangovers. But what if you died? Boring? Not everyone made it to Odin's Golden Hall. In fact, most people didn't. If you died of old age, disease, or anything that didn't involve glorious combat, your soul took a different road, usually to hell. Now, hell wasn't exactly the Christian hell. It wasn't fire and brimstone. It was colder. Literally. Picture a shadowy, mist-laden realm beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree. A place of stillness, ruled by the goddess Hel, Loki's daughter, whose vibe is half beautiful woman, half corpse. Imagine trying to make small talk at that dinner party. And this hell wasn't inherently evil. It was simply where you went if you hadn't earned a warrior's death, The sagas describe it as dreary but not torturous, more like a medieval retirement home with worse food and less bingo. Other destinations, the fine print of Norse afterlife. Die at sea? You might go to Ran, the sea goddess, who welcomed drowned sailors by dragging them to her hall. Sounds nice until you realize she caught you in a net first. Die in childbirth? There are whispers in the lore that Freya, the goddess of love and war, took such women to her hall, Folkvanger, a realm said to rival Valhalla in its beauty. In fact, some sagas claim Freya got first pick of the battle slain before Odin. Which means you could live and die as a fierce Viking only to find out the Rio VIP lounge wasn't Odin's hall at all. In short, the afterlife was complicated. And it came with fine print. The Vikings didn't just believe in these realms, they sent their dead off like they were boarding the ultimate adventure cruise. Take the famous account of a Rus chieftain's funeral, written by the Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan. The chieftain's body was placed on a ship, surrounded by weapons, goods, and even sacrificed animals, and in this case, a volunteer, or coerced, concubine. They burned the ship, believing the smoke carried his spirit to the next world. Morbid? Absolutely. But it was also a party, feasting, music, and ritual, a celebration of the journey ahead. You might think these beliefs were just a way to soften the sting of death. And sure, they were. But they were also a call to action. If you wanted Valhalla, you couldn't live timidly. You had to die with your weapon in hand, facing your fate head-on. Even for those who never wielded a sword, the mythology reinforced something deeper. Life was fragile, but death? Death could be purposeful. That's why Viking warriors charged into hopeless battles. Why women whispered prayers to Freya in childbirth. Why families left offerings at burial mounds. They weren't just mourning their dead, they were keeping the story alive, for the living and the fallen alike. And so the hall fades, the golden light of Valhalla dimming like the last ember in a hearth. You're back under the Nordic night sky, the cold biting again. But now you carry something new, a sense of how deeply the afterlife shaped their every choice. But before we leave these stories of death and destiny, there's something else we need to talk about, the women of this world. They weren't just bystanders in this saga. They were farmers, priestesses, shield maidens, power brokers, and storytellers. So come, back into the longhouse we go. Let's meet them. Step back into the longhouse. The hall is quieter now. The warriors have fallen asleep where they drank, snoring softly in a tangle of limbs and empty mead horns. But in the dim light of the hearth, others are still awake, weaving, mending, tending to the children and the fire. And at the center of it all is a woman, keys jangling at her belt as she moves between tasks with the quiet authority of someone who knows this place, and everything in it belongs to her. Forget what Hollywood told you about Viking women being passive bystanders in the background of a man's saga. The reality? They ran this world more than you'd think. Literally. In Norse society, keys were a symbol of power. The woman of the house wore them at her waist, jangling from a ring or chain, unlocking storerooms, chests, and pantries. She controlled the food, the valuables, and by extension, the household economy. If the Viking man was the sword arm of the home, the woman was the spine. When he left for raiding, trading, or just wandering off in search of Odin knows what, she became head of the farm, overseeing harvests, managing slaves or servants, handling trade. And make no mistake, this wasn't just unpaid drudgery. These were recognized roles of authority. A good household mistress could negotiate deals, settle disputes, and if necessary, drag a wayward relative to the thing, the Viking court, and call them to account. You want to see true power? Watch a Viking woman scold a drunk man twice her size until he hands over the last of the winter ale because she knows there's still 2 months of frost left. Marriage in Viking society was complicated. It was as much a business arrangement as it was a personal one, often negotiated between families. But unlike in much of medieval Europe, Viking women had rights. Real ones. Unhappy with your husband? You could divorce him. Publicly. All you had to do was declare your intent before witnesses, return his dowry, and, my favorite part, literally pack up his stuff and leave it outside. Congratulations, you're single again. Men could divorce women too, of course, but that didn't mean they came out unscathed. There's a fantastic little saga where a woman divorces her husband for wearing low-cut shirts and showing too much chest. He's humiliated, and she walks away with her reputation intact. Oh, and don't think women were shy about calling out bad behavior. In the Laxdæla saga, Gernasvar's daughter, a legendary figure known for her wit and ruthlessness, curses a man by taking off her underpants, turning them inside out, and reciting a spell over them. Imagine the sheer force of what it takes to make your undergarments a weapon. Women weren't just household managers, they also held spiritual power. Seeresses, or volar, were respected and feared. They practiced seer, a form of magic involving prophecy, trances, and rituals that could nudge fate itself. Their arrival in a village was an event. They'd be given the high seat in the longhouse, fed the choicest foods, and asked to divine the future for warriors, farmers, or even whole communities. There's a famous account from the saga of Eric the Red describing a volva draped in blue and black, carrying a staff tipped with brass, performing rites so unnerving the audience sat in absolute silence, except for one girl singing an old, eerie chant to guide her into the trance. And Odin himself? He practiced seer, which made some men uncomfortable, because this kind of magic was considered unmanly. But Odin didn't care. He wanted wisdom, and the women held it. Now let's address the question you're probably asking: were Viking women really warriors? The sagas say yes sometimes. Figures like Lagertha, famously said to have fought beside Ragnar, or Hervir, who retrieved a cursed sword from her father's burial mound while surrounded by ghosts, loom large in Norse storytelling. Archaeology adds fuel to the fire. The famous Birka warrior burial in Sweden, once thought to be a man, turned out to be a woman, buried with weapons, gaming pieces, and a horse. That doesn't scream camp follower. That screams commander. Still, were shield maidens common? Probably not. But rare doesn't mean non-existent. And even if many of these stories were more myth than reality, that they could be imagined says a lot about the fluidity of gender roles in Viking lore. The sagas are full of women who drive the plot with terrifying efficiency. Take Huldrun Jal's saga, who refuses to give her husband a lock of her hair for a bowstring during a siege, because he once slapped her in public. Petty? Maybe. But also brilliant. She turns her humiliation into vengeance, and he dies for underestimating her. Or think of Freydis, the half-sister of Leif Erikson, who sailed to Vinland, North America, and when outnumbered by natives in battle, allegedly grabbed a sword, bared her chest, and charged screaming at the enemy. They fled. Because if a half-naked, sword-wielding Viking woman is running at you, you also would. Viking women weren't just supporting characters. They were farmers, merchants, healers, storytellers, mystics, and sometimes warriors. They were the ones who kept the longhouse warm, the fields alive, and the sagas worth telling. And maybe that's the point. In a world as harsh as the Viking Age, survival wasn't about brute strength alone. It was about resilience, adaptability, knowing when to pick up a sword and when to wield a curse instead. But the longhouse is never quiet for long. Outside, you can already hear the rhythmic pounding of hammers on wood. It's time to step into the shipyard, to smell the fresh-cut pine and tar, and watch the long, sleek beasts of the sea take shape. Because next we sail. It is dawn, and the sea is calling. You step out of the longhouse into a world still wrapped in mist, the air damp and briny. The ground crunches beneath your boots as you walk toward the sound, the slow, steady thud of mallets on wood, the rasp of saws biting into pine. The shipyard is alive. There, pulled up on the pebbled shore like a great sleeping serpent, is the vessel that made the Vikings who they were, the longship. Even at rest, it looks alive. Sleek. Predatory. Its carved prow, often a dragon or serpent, stares out at the horizon as if it can already smell the coasts it will one day raid or trade upon. This is no simple fishing craft. This is a weapon, a symbol, a lifeline. And today, we board it. Before we set sail, let's marvel at the craft itself. Longships were miracles of engineering for their time, long and narrow, often 60 to 100 feet in length, shallow enough to navigate rivers yet sturdy enough to cross oceans. Their overlapping planks, a technique called clinker building, gave them flexibility, allowing them to ride waves instead of smashing against them. And the keel? That long, strong spine of the ship was like magic. It kept the longship stable and fast, giving it the grace of a predator slicing through water. They were powered by oars, up to 60 of them, and a single, square sail woven from wool so tightly it could catch even the faintest breath of wind. These ships were light enough to drag across land if needed, yet strong enough to carry warriors to the far edges of the known world. Think of it this way. If the longhouse was the Viking hearth, the longship was its beating heart. You step onto the deck. It's little more than open planking, slick with dew. There are no cabins, no comforts. If you want shelter, you huddle under the sail with your crewmates or sleep on your shield. Every inch of space is functional. Benches double as rowing stations and sleeping spots. Storage for food and weapons is tucked wherever it will fit. The ship smells of pine tar and salt, the tar used to waterproof the planks, the salt from countless journeys that came before this one. A tang of iron hangs in the air too, from weapons stowed in bundles, ready for the day someone decides this voyage is about more than trade. The helmsman, Strymar, calls out, and the oars dip into the water in perfect unison. The sound is hypnotic. The creak of the oarlocks, the splash of blades biting into the sea, the rhythmic grunt of rowers. This is hard work. Your shoulders burn after only a few strokes. But for the Vikings, this was daily life. Rowing wasn't just transportation, it was survival. Ships didn't wait for good wind, they moved under muscle and willpower when needed. And when the sail does catch? Oh, it's like the ship comes alive. The oars are stowed, the canvas billows, and suddenly the longship flies, gliding over the waves at a speed that shocked the people they encountered. How did they know where they were going? The Vikings didn't have compasses as we do. They had the sun, the stars, and their own ingenuity. One saga tells of Floki Vildrarson, the man credited with discovering Iceland. He brought ravens on his voyage. When land wasn't in sight, he released them. If they circled and returned, he knew land was far away. If they flew off and didn't return, land was near. Imagine standing on this deck, watching a raven cut across the horizon, knowing its wings might lead you to a new world. Not every longship was built for raiding. Some were Nars, broader, deeper ships designed for cargo, carrying furs, walrus ivory, amber, or enslaved people to trade markets as far as Baghdad. Others were pure warships, low, sleek, bristling with shields hung along the sides like armor. These were the terror of medieval Europe, ships that could slip silently up a river at night, disgorge warriors onto a monastery shore, and be gone before the locals even lit their torches. To the Vikings, the difference between merchant and raider was often flexible. A ship leaving Norway with furs could return with silver, silk, and if opportunity presented itself, the spoils of a raid. Life afloat. Romantic? Hardly. Life aboard a longship was brutal. There were no toilets, no privacy, and meals were whatever dried fish or hard bread you'd packed. When the weather turned foul, you were soaked and freezing. When the sea was calm, the monotony of rowing under a hot sun could drive you mad. And yet, for all its misery, the longship carried dreams, of wealth, of glory, of freedom. To step aboard one of these vessels was to put your life in the hands of the sea and the gods. And many believe that if you died here, sword in hand, you might just earn that place in Valhalla. We can't overstate what these ships meant. With them, the Vikings reached Constantinople, Greenland, and even North America, 5 centuries before Columbus. When the Byzantine emperor first saw them arrive on the Bosporus, he reportedly hired them on the spot as his elite bodyguards, the Varangian Guard. Imagine his surprise. "Ah, yes, the people who terrorized my trade routes. Now they'll defend my throne." This was the paradox of the longship. It made the Vikings both feared raiders and trusted mercenaries, both destroyers and indispensable traders. You make your way to the prow, where the carved dragon head stares defiantly into the fog. The spray hits your face, cold and stinging, and you feel it, why the sea called to them. It wasn't just about raiding. It was about expansion. About seeing what lay beyond the horizon. About becoming more than a farmer bound to a strip of frozen land. The ship groans as the waves lift it, the crew chanting softly to keep time as the oars dip again. Ahead, the mist parts. Land, or maybe just another stretch of sea, it doesn't matter. For now, you are part of the longship's living body. And like the Vikings before you, you will go wherever it takes you. But this journey doesn't end on the open water. The Vikings weren't only raiders or sailors. They were merchants, explorers, settlers, people who carried their culture across continents. So next, let's follow them ashore. From the markets of the Middle East to the edges of North America, the Norse left their mark in places you might never expect. The ship rocks gently beneath your feet, and the sea wind smells different now, warmer, spiced with hints of lands far from the fjords. You're no longer on a raiding voyage. Today, you are following the Vikings as they transformed from plunderers to merchants, explorers, and settlers. This is no small journey. From the cold edge of Vinland to the glittering markets of Constantinople, the Norse carved pathways across the known world, leaving stories, and sometimes trouble, wherever they went. Here's the thing about Vikings: they didn't see a difference between raiding and trading. You take what you can, you barter for what you can't, and if negotiations fail, well, you still get what you want. But as their world expanded, so did their approach. By the 9th century, Viking merchants were threading themselves into vast trade networks. Their ships carried amber from the Baltic, furs from the frozen north, walrus ivory, and more grimly enslaved people, all bound for foreign markets. In return, they brought back silver, silk, spices, and ideas that would change Norse culture forever. Our first landfall? The Emerald Coast of Ireland. The year is 841. The Irish call these invaders Dubgail, dark foreigners. But the Vikings do more than raid monasteries here, they stay. They build a fortified settlement on the River Liffey, Dublin. Within a century, it's a thriving hub of Norse Gaelic culture, where Irish monks haggle with Norse traders over slaves and silver. It's chaotic, multicultural, and dangerous. And from here, the Norse launch raids deeper into Ireland, or west toward the Atlantic. It's hard to imagine now, but Dublin, the Irish capital, was once a Viking town. Leave the Atlantic and turn your prow eastward. Through the snaking rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine, the Vikings, here called the Rus, became the great middlemen between Europe and the Islamic world. Their longships, laden with furs and slaves, glided along the Dnieper and Volga, connecting the Baltic to the Black Sea and Caspian. And at the end of those rivers? Wealth unimaginable. Imagine stepping off a longship and walking into Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire. The Vikings called it Miklagar, the great city. They marveled at its marble streets, its towering churches, its markets bursting with silk, wine, and exotic spices. And the Byzantines? They were impressed enough to put these barbarians on the payroll. Thus was born the Varangian Guard, a corps of elite warriors sworn to protect the Byzantine emperor himself. There's a great story of Harald Hardrada, a Norwegian prince who served in this guard, amassing such wealth and fame that when he returned home, he used it to seize a throne. So yes, the same Vikings who once terrorized monasteries became the personal bodyguards of emperors. Life comes at you fast. How do we know the Vikings made it this far? Silver. Thousands of Arabic dirhams, Islamic coins, have been found in Viking graves and hoards across Scandinavia. These coins weren't just currency, they were status symbols. Melted down, they became arm rings or were buried with their owners to flaunt wealth in the afterlife. It's a reminder that when you picture a Viking, don't just imagine a blood-spattered warrior. Imagine a savvy merchant counting coins minted in Baghdad. Let's change course. Turn the ship west. Past Iceland. Past Greenland. Into the midst of a new world. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, landed on the coast of North America. They called it Vinland, the land of wine, for its wild grapes and fertile soil. For a brief moment, Norse settlements bloomed here, likely in what's now Newfoundland. But they didn't last. Conflicts with the indigenous peoples, harsh winters, and sheer distance doomed the experiment. Still, for a few fleeting years, Vikings stood on the shores of a continent no European would see again for nearly 500 years. And how were they received? According to the sagas, warily. The Norse called the locals Skrælingr, and quickly learned they were not to be underestimated. One skirmish turned deadly after a Viking killed a native trader, leading to an attack so fierce that Leif's people abandoned their settlement. It's a brief, bittersweet chapter, a reminder that exploration was as much about humility as conquest. Of course, not all Norse voyages were about silver or glory. Some were about survival. In Iceland, Norway's outcasts, rebels, dreamers, and exiles, built a society of poets and lawmakers. In Greenland, they eked out a living on the edge of the world, farming in a land that barely tolerated life. These settlers carried their gods, their language, and their sagas with them, planting Norse culture like a stubborn weed in every new soil they touched. By the end of the Viking Age, the Norse world was a web. From Newfoundland to Novgorod, their routes connected distant lands and cultures, turning isolated fjords into threads in a vast, tangled network of trade and story. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it, the slap of oars on foreign rivers, the creak of ships in Mediterranean harbors, the low murmur of Norse merchants haggling in languages not their own. But we've seen the Vikings as merchants and wanderers. Now let's turn back to the rituals that bound them together when they returned home. Weddings, funerals, and the ceremonies that marked life and death in their world. If you really want to know a people, look at how they celebrate beginnings, and how they mourn endings. For the Vikings, life was a brief, flickering thing, cradled between cold winters and violent seas. So they marked their milestones with ceremony. Weddings, funerals, births, deaths, these weren't just private affairs. They were public declarations of who you were, what you believed, and how you wanted to be remembered. Let's start with weddings. To our modern eyes, Viking weddings sound strange, less romantic walk down the aisle, and more corporate merger with drinking privileges. Marriage was as much about strengthening alliances and consolidating wealth as it was about love. But don't mistake these unions for cold transactions. They had their own power, pageantry, and even tenderness. A Viking bride began her wedding day as a daughter and ended it as a mistress of her new household. To mark the shift, she underwent a symbolic shedding of her old life, removing her maiden's headdress and donning a married woman's headpiece, often with help from female relatives who whispered advice about managing her new role. Meanwhile, the groom carried a sword, often an ancestral one, into the ceremony, a not-so-so statement that, "Yes, I can protect you, and yes, I know how to use this if needed." Romantic? Maybe not. But effective. At the feast, the couple drank mead together from a shared cup. Mead wasn't just booze, it was sacred. Its sweetness symbolized the hope for a fruitful union, while its intoxicating nature, well, let's say it helped everyone get in the mood for the next part of the evening. There's a saga that tells of a bride who refused to consummate her marriage because her husband had insulted her family. She sat at the edge of the bed, fully dressed, night after night, until he finally offered a proper apology, in the form of generous gifts. Vikings understood that respect had to be negotiated, even in marriage. If marriage was a strategic alliance, childbirth was a battlefield. It was dangerous, fatally so, for both mother and child. Which is why it had layers of ritual. Midwives invoked Freya, goddess of fertility and magic, and placed protective charms in the birthing room. Runes were carved into wood or bone to ward off spirits lurking in the shadows. Newborns weren't automatically accepted into the family. The father would perform an tber, a kind of acceptance ritual, by lifting the child onto his knee. Until then, the child's fate hung in the balance. It sounds harsh, but in a world of limited resources, this ritual also symbolized survival. The community could only keep those it had the strength to raise. Nowhere did Viking ritual shine more vividly than in death. To die was not just to end, it was to embark. And the journey required supplies. Everyone imagines Vikings being sent off in burning ships. The truth? That happened, but rarely. Most burials were simpler, bodies laid in boats on land or buried in mounds, with grave goods to ease their passage. Weapons, jewelry, tools, even animals, all packed for the road ahead. One of the most vivid descriptions comes from Ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab traveler. He witnessed the funeral of a Rus chieftain, first, days of mourning, feasting, and ritual drinking. Then, the sacrifice of animals, and even a slave woman, who volunteered to join her master in death. Finally, they placed the chieftain on a ship, surrounded by treasures, and burned him, sending his spirit skyward in smoke. Ibn Fadlan's tone is somewhere between awe and horror. But to the Norse, this was beauty, a death ritual that honored the dead and fed the living's hope for their own glorious send-off. Because rituals gave structure to chaos. When you live in a world where winters can starve you and the sea can swallow you, you need markers, things that make sense of it all. Weddings anchored families to one another. Childbirth rites begged the gods to spare new life. Funerals helped the living believe that their dead had not vanished into nothingness, but journeyed to halls beyond imagining. Archaeology adds fascinating footnotes to these rituals. In a grave in Osberg, Norway, 2 women were buried in a lavishly decorated ship with tapestries, carts, and sleighs. One of them was likely a high-status woman, perhaps even a priestess or queen. Their burial was so grand that even in death, they were still telling their community, "This is who we are. This is our place in the story." The Vikings didn't see life's milestones as isolated events. They were threads in a larger tapestry, a saga woven of gods and men, blood and mead, grief and joy. And maybe that's why their rituals still fascinate us. They remind us that even 1,000 years ago, people wanted what we want now, to be seen, to be celebrated, to be remembered. And speaking of being remembered, what happens when you wrong someone in this world? When disputes flare, or honor is at stake? That's where we go next, into the thing, the Viking court, where law was shouted in open air and justice came not from judges in robes, but from neighbors with long memories and sharp axes. The morning air is brisk as you climb the low hill, following the sound of voices. It's louder than you expected, not the quiet, reverent hush of a modern courtroom, but the chaotic hum of a market day. Men and women cluster in groups, their cloaks snapping in the wind, their faces set with purpose. A dog barks somewhere. Children dart between the legs of the crowd. The smell of smoke and wet wool mixes with that of freshly trampled grass. You've arrived at the thing, the Viking court. But this is no marble-pillared hall. Justice in the Norse world happens under the open sky, on a patch of neutral ground, a hill, an island, a grove of sacred trees. This isn't just law, it's community theater, politics, and if tempers flare, a prelude to bloodshed. The thing, or ing, was the beating heart of Viking justice. Every free man, and sometimes free women, had the right to attend. Here, disputes were settled, laws recited, marriages arranged, and alliances forged. It was democracy in its rawest form, messy, loud, and public. There were no secret juries or written verdicts. Instead, law was spoken aloud by the skimmer, the law speaker, a living archive who memorized the rules of the land. Imagine standing in that crowd as the law speaker raises his staff and begins to chant the law. No paper. No parchment. Just his voice carrying centuries of precedent on the wind. You push through the throng. Everywhere you look, there's a case being argued. Over there, two farmers are shouting about grazing rights. One swears the other let his goats trample his barley. Just beyond them, a gaunt-looking man kneels, begging his neighbors for wergild, blood money, for his murdered brother. Nearby, a group of women whisper, their faces veiled. They're here to petition for divorce. Their husbands, they claim, broke their marriage contracts. One of them clutches a ring of keys, the symbol of her household authority, ready to surrender them in exchange for her freedom. The air crackles with tension. The thing isn't just about laws. It's about honor. And in Viking society, honor is currency. In this world, justice is transactional. If you kill a man, you don't automatically swing from a noose. Instead, you pay his family wergild, a fine based on his social rank. Kill a freeman? That'll cost you. Kill a chieftain? Prepare to hand over everything you own. Can't pay? Then it's exile, or vengeance. And vengeance is never far away. The sagas are full of feuds that began with unpaid wergild and spiraled into decades of bloodletting. Justice, here, isn't about rehabilitation. It's about balance, restoring the social order before chaos swallows it whole. The most powerful figure here is the skimmer. He's part judge, part historian, part walking audiobook. One saga tells of a law speaker who could recite the entire legal code without stopping for breath. When a dispute dragged on for days, he stood at the thing, bellowing statutes until even the combatants begged for compromise. His voice, not the sword, won the day. But not every law speaker was so lucky. Another tale tells of one who ruled against a powerful chieftain. Days later, his body washed up on the shore, his tongue cut out, a brutal message: justice has limits when power takes offense. Sometimes, arguments don't end in handshakes. When two parties can't agree, the thing allows for holmgang, trial by combat. The rules are straightforward: pick a flat piece of ground, draw a boundary, and fight until someone yields, dies, or limps away missing something vital. To our ears, it sounds barbaric. But to the Vikings, it was strangely fair. The gods, they believed, favored the righteous. And if you died? Well, perhaps Odin thought you were ready for Valhalla. Anecdote: one saga tells of a man who challenged his accuser to holmgang but brought a shield so massive it couldn't be broken. His opponent, unimpressed, set the shield on fire. It worked. He won the case, and burned the man's beard off in the process. Though Viking society was patriarchal, women weren't voiceless here. They could bring cases for divorce, inheritance, or personal injury. Some even argued on behalf of their families. The sagas describe sharp-tongued women goading their husbands into action at the thing. Are you a man, or are you going to let him take your land? Once, a widow successfully sued her late husband's killer for wergild. She collected the payment herself and used it to secure her children's future, an early glimpse at women using the legal system as a shield in a dangerous world. As the day drags on, you notice something. Not everyone came here for justice. Some came to be seen. Chieftains parade their wealth and eloquence. Merchants strike deals in the shadow of legal proceedings. Skalds compose verses on the spot, turning feuds into entertainment. The thing is part courtroom, part parliament, part festival. It's where the community affirms itself, loudly, imperfectly, but undeniably alive. Not every case ends cleanly. When the thing can't resolve a feud, the combatants leave with their rage intact, and often, with plans for vengeance. The sagas are full of these failures, families slaughtered in the night, neighbors burning each other's halls to ash. Justice in the Viking Age was precarious. It worked, until it didn't. And when it didn't, blood was the only argument left. As the sun dips low, the thing begins to wind down. The crowd thins. Some leave satisfied, having reclaimed their honor in silver or words. Others leave plotting revenge. And you realize, the thing wasn't just about laws. It was about survival. A fragile attempt to impose order on a world where chaos, in the form of war, feud, or famine, was always just over the horizon. But order wasn't only kept with laws. The Vikings also turned to something stranger: magic. Runes carved on bones, chants whispered under breath, and visions drawn from the other world. So next, let's walk into the shadows of their beliefs, into the realm of seer, runes, and the dangerous power of Viking sorcery. The fire burns low in the longhouse. Its glow dances across the faces of those gathered, and the air feels heavy, thicker than smoke alone. Someone has shuttered the door. Someone has scattered herbs on the coals, their sharp, resinous scent mingling with the tang of pine and wool. And then she enters. The Volva. You've heard of her before. Every village has one, a seeress, a sorceress, a walker between worlds. She wears a cloak of dark blue, trimmed with cat fur. A staff capped with bronze rings rests in her hand, its weight more ceremonial than practical. The people part as she passes, a living contradiction, feared and revered in equal measure. You watch as she takes her seat on the high platform, above even the chieftain. Her eyes sweep the room, but it feels like she's seeing something far beyond it. This is seer. In the Viking world, seer was a kind of magic practiced to see, and sometimes shape, the threads of fate. It was trance work. Spirit work. A way to reach into the unseen and return with something: prophecy, protection, vengeance. It blurred the lines between the human and divine, the living and the dead. The rituals were intimate and unsettling. The Volva would chant, drum, or hum to lull herself into an altered state, sometimes aided by a chorus of women singing old, secret songs called varlukr. She might sway, weep, or convulse as she traveled in that liminal space between worlds. The Norse feared seer because it worked in that liminal space, where normal rules no longer applied. It was powerful. It was dangerous. And it was often feminine. But here's the twist: the most famous practitioner of seer wasn't a woman. It was Odin himself. The sagas tell us Odin learned seer from Freya, goddess of love and magic. He hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days to gain the runes, bled for wisdom, and bent his own godhood in service of powers no one fully understood. And yet, the practice was considered unmanly. Warriors mocked seer for its associations with women's work, weaving, spinning, subtle manipulation rather than brute force. That Odin himself wielded it shows how far he'd go to gather power. If losing an eye for knowledge didn't prove it, this certainly did. If seer was the whisper of the gods, runes were their written word. Carved into wood, stone, or bone, runes weren't just letters. They were symbols of power, each carrying meaning beyond mere sounds. To inscribe a rune on a weapon was to bless it with victory. To carve one on a doorpost was to ward off evil. Runes show up everywhere, on amulets, ship timbers, memorial stones. Some were curses, the Norse equivalent of "touch this and die screaming." Others were charms for fertility, wealth, or safe passage. One rune carver in the sagas leaves a chilling warning: "I carved these runes to protect this grave. May the breaker of them become prey for wolves." Imagine standing in a silent burial mound, running your fingers over those grooves, and wondering if the curse still holds. Seer wasn't just for prophecy or love spells. It went to war. Some accounts tell of Viking leaders hiring Volur to curse their enemies before battle, calling storms to wreck their ships or striking their warriors with paralyzing fear. Others describe warriors themselves using battle magic, chanting incantations, painting runes on shields, or donning animal pelts to take on the ferocity of bears and wolves. The berserker, those legendary, frothing mad warriors, may have used magic, mushrooms, or both to enter their trance-like rages. It was part performance, part sorcery, all terror. One of the most vivid descriptions of Seer comes from the saga of Eric the Red. A Volva is invited to a Greenland settlement stricken by famine. She arrives dressed in blue and black, carrying her staff, and is offered a meal of porridge and hearts, the best they can give. She performs her ritual as the villagers chant around her, slipping into a trance. When she returns, she announces that the famine will pass, that better times are coming. And just like that, hope, the rarest magic of all, fills the hall. Because magic gave power to those on society's margins. A woman could stand above a chieftain. A slave could curse their master. A god could transgress gender norms in pursuit of wisdom. In a world built on hierarchies of strength, Seer turned the rules upside down. And perhaps that's why the Christians who came later tried so hard to stamp it out. The fire in the longhouse pops, snapping you out of your reverie. The vulva rises, her work done. The air feels lighter now, but also charged, as if the smoke has left more than a scent. And you realize, in this world, there were no clear lines between the natural and the supernatural. The gods walked among mortals. The dead whispered through the living. And fate? It was something you could touch, if you were willing to risk the price. But magic wasn't the only way the Vikings crossed boundaries. Their journeys brought them into contact with Christians, Muslims, and cultures that saw the world in utterly different ways. So next, let's step off the longship and walk into those meeting places, to see how the Norse reshaped, and were reshaped by, the worlds they touched. The sea has carried you far from the fjords. You stand at the prow of a longship as the sun rises over foreign waters. Behind you lies the familiar world of longhouses, mead halls, and sagas whispered by the fire. Ahead? The unknown, lands where the language tastes strange in your mouth, where the gods wear different faces, and where the Vikings are not lords of their own story, but guests, or invaders. Let's step into two such worlds. Two encounters where the Norse came face to face with cultures as different from their own as night and day, and left changed forever. It begins with silence. The kind of silence that clings to holy places. You are walking through a monastery garden on the northeast coast of England in the year 793. The morning is cool, the sky pale. A monk tends the herbs, muttering prayers as bees drone lazily around him. His life is one of rhythm, prayer, work, contemplation. Then, the rhythm breaks. A distant thrum. The slap of oars on water. He looks up. Shapes are cutting through the mist on the horizon. Long, sleek ships with dragon heads for prows. His heart stumbles. He has heard the stories. He drops his tools and runs for the bell tower. By the time the bell rings, it's too late. The Vikings are ashore. They move fast, faster than the monks can comprehend. They are broad-shouldered, sunburned, shouting in a language that sounds like thunder. They smash the doors. The monastery, a sanctuary for books and bones of saints, becomes a slaughterhouse. Why attack here? Because monasteries are wealthy and undefended. Gold chalices, jeweled reliquaries, silver crosses, treasures meant for God, but tempting for men who believe their own gods demand spoils. The monks will write about this raid at Lindisfarne with horror. They will call it a sign of the apocalypse. The pagans desecrated the holy place of God. For them, the Vikings are the very face of evil. But from the Norse side? This is survival. A chance at wealth beyond imagining. Odin himself would nod in approval. The two worlds collide here, one cloistered, quiet, and devoted to a singular god, the other loud, hungry, and carried by many gods who thrive on chaos. Neither side fully understands the other, but each leaves its mark. Within a few generations, those same raiders will convert to Christianity. They will kneel in churches built on the ruins they once burned. And in doing so, they will carry pieces of their old gods with them, leaving faint echoes of Odin behind the altar. Now we sail southeast. The air grows warmer, perfumed with spices. The sea darkens to a deep, rich blue. And ahead of us rises Constantinople, Miklagar, the great city. Imagine it through Viking eyes, marble walls so high they scrape the clouds. Gates inlaid with bronze. A harbor thick with ships from every corner of the known world. This is no monastery to be plundered. This is an empire. The Byzantines do not see barbarians. They see opportunity. These tall, flax-haired men with their foreign weapons are perfect for one thing: guarding the emperor. And so the Varangian Guard is born, an elite corps of Norse warriors sworn to the Byzantine throne. Step into their boots for a moment. One day, you are rowing a Nar through frozen fjords. The next, you are standing in the gold-glittering halls of the great palace, watching the emperor of the Romans pass by in robes that shimmer like fire. There's a story about Harald Hardrada, a Norwegian prince who joined the Guard in the 11th century. He fought in Sicily, the Holy Land, and the Balkans, amassing so much wealth that when he returned to Norway, he used it to seize the crown. The sagas tell us Harald kept a chest of Byzantine gold buried under a riverbank, a dragon's hoard earned with his sword. But here's what's more interesting: the exchange wasn't just of gold. The Norse brought back ideas, fashions, even religious practices. A warrior who left a pagan farmstead might return speaking Greek prayers and wearing silk. Imagine how strange it must have felt to straddle those two worlds, to pray to Christ in a cathedral by day and still whisper to Odin by night. These two stories, a monastery burned, a palace guarded, show the full range of Norse contact with the world. They could be destroyers, feared as demons in monkish chronicles. Or they could be protectors, trusted by emperors to keep their thrones safe. In truth, they were both. And with each encounter, the Vikings changed. They absorbed what they found: Christian faith, Byzantine art, Eastern coinage. They carried these things home, stitched them into their own culture, and in doing so became something more than raiders. They became connectors, the living bridge between worlds that rarely met. As you leave the great city and the roar of its markets, you can feel it. The Norse world is no longer confined to its fjords. It stretches from the cold edge of Vinland to the gates of Byzantium. And yet, for all their travels, some questions remain unanswered. What happened to the lost settlements? Did the sagas tell truth, or just convenient lies? Which of their legends are history, and which are simply wishful storytelling? That's where we go next, into the mysteries of the Viking Age. The night has grown long. The last embers in the hearth glow faintly, painting the room in deep red shadows. Outside, the wind rattles the wooden walls like a restless spirit, and somewhere in the darkness, a dog lets out a low, uneasy growl. It's the perfect time for questions, the kind that don't have clean answers. Pull your furs tighter. This is where the sagas blur, where archaeology gives us fragments, and where the Vikings themselves seem to slip away into smoke. You've heard the sagas. Leif Erikson sails west, guided by rumors and restless ambition, and lands on a place of wild grapes, mild winters, and endless promise. Vinland. We know they were there. The Norse settlement at Lonsaux Meadows in Newfoundland proves it. But beyond that? It's like chasing mist. Where exactly did they go? How far did they push into North America? Did they clash with indigenous peoples only at the shoreline, or deeper inland? The sagas mention Skrælingr, their name for the locals, but are frustratingly vague about who these people were. And then there's the question that gnaws at historians: why did they leave? Was it the hostility of the land? The weight of distance? Or did the Norse simply decide that the promise of Vinland wasn't worth the blood it would take to hold it? Sometimes I like to picture it, a lone Viking ship on a foggy morning, turning its prow east, leaving behind a half-built settlement, the fire pits still warm. A quiet retreat from a dream they couldn't make real. Then there's Greenland. The Norse clung to that ice-bitten island for nearly 500 years. They built farms, raised cattle, and even sent bishops to Rome. And then, they vanished. Archaeological digs reveal abandoned churches, empty farmsteads, and graves that grow fewer and fewer over time. But why? Some say climate change, the Little Ice Age turning fields to frost and shutting down trade. Others think disease, famine, or conflict with the Inuit sealed their fate. There are even whispers that they abandoned Christianity altogether, going native, and merging with the people who could survive where they couldn't. What's left are ruins under the snow, mute stones keeping their secrets. And what about the legendary figures of the sagas? Did Ragnar Lothbrok really exist, or was he a stitched-together composite of a dozen different raiders, bound into one neat, tragic hero? Did Lager, the famed shield maiden, truly lead warriors into battle, or was she a storyteller's creation to thrill audiences by firelight? Even the great Eric the Red and his son Leif stand at the crossroads of history and myth. They appear in records, yes, but the sagas make them larger than life, too neat, too dramatic, too perfectly flawed to feel entirely real. Maybe that was the point. Somewhere, under silt and salt water, lie ships that never made it home. Longships swallowed by storms. Merchant vessels heavy with silver and silk, now rotting in the blackness. Occasionally, we find one, a preserved hull, a burial ship cradling its warrior in iron and gold. But most remain hidden, their timbers quietly dissolving. Sometimes I wonder what stories those wrecks could tell, of voyages cut short, of treasures lost, of voices silenced in the cold sea. It's tempting to want neat answers. But maybe the allure of the Vikings lies in what we can't know. Their sagas leave gaps on purpose, giving us room to imagine. Their ruins whisper instead of shout. Their bones tell us how they lived, but rarely why. And so we're left with these questions, fragments of a people who lived between worlds, who left just enough of themselves behind to haunt us. The fire pops, pulling you back. The night is still. The mysteries remain unsolved. And maybe they always will. But that doesn't make the journey meaningless. In fact, it's what makes it human. And so, we come to the end of our wandering. One last chapter remains, to step back, to breathe, and to reflect on how the Vikings, in all their contradictions, still echo in our lives 1,000 years later. The fire has burned down to embers. The longhouse is quiet now. The warriors have gone. The skald has finished his last tale. All that remains is the soft hiss of the coals and the faint creak of wood in the night wind. It's here, in this stillness, that we can finally step back and see the Vikings as they truly were. Not just raiders. Not just traders. Not just the wild-eyed figures painted in the margins of frightened monks' manuscripts. They were farmers, poets, explorers, dreamers. They were people who laughed by the fire, who bargained in markets, who whispered prayers before setting out on dangerous seas. People who buried their dead with care and carved their hopes into runestones so their names would echo long after their voices were gone. Their world is gone. The longhouses have rotted. The sails have crumbled. The sagas we tell about them are as much myth as memory. And yet, listen, you can still hear them. In the lilt of Nordic languages, in the carved beams of Scandinavian churches that once stood where their temples were, in the very shape of our stories about courage and exploration. When we speak of journeys into the unknown, of fighting against impossible odds, of defying death itself, we are speaking their language. Sometimes I wonder, did they know how far they travel? Not just across seas and rivers, but across time, into our imaginations, into our art, into our sense of what it means to be bold. Perhaps that's their greatest legacy. Not the silver they hoarded or the lands they claimed, but the way they've remained, alive, in stories. In us. So, as the coals fade and the night deepens, let's leave them here, gathered in the glow of a mead hall, singing of gods and heroes, laughing in the face of the darkness beyond the door. Warriors and weavers, destroyers and builders, dreamers of Valhalla, the Vikings. And so, as the night settles, may these echoes of the past guide you gently into dreams. And now, I believe you're already drifting off, so just let the soft crackle of the fire carry you into the sweetest dreams.